She was so rich, she was able to commit murder in the street in front of her mansion and still get away with it. In 1925, at the age of 12, Doris Duke inherits more than $50 million from her father. Even with all this money, she has a reputation of being cheap and violent. Cheap to the point that she wouldn't tip taxi drivers and she wouldn't eat fresh chicken because it costs cents more, and violent to the point that she attacked a past partner with a butcher knife during a fight. Given her reputation, many people don't want to work with her, except for artistic curator and designer Eduardo Tirella. For a decade, he worked with Duke decorating and refurbishing her 4 estates, but by 1966, he had enough of her antics and was getting work from Hollywood films, designing sets for Elizabeth Taylor, and he was friends with icons like Sharon Tate. So by this point, Eduardo, who friends called Eddie, is ready to move to the West Coast and officially cut ties with Duke. Given the kind of person he is, he decides to fly out to Newport, Rhode Island and visit Duke at her estate to break the news. Saying that she doesn't take it well is an understatement. Shortly before 5 p.m., the staff at the estate report hearing a loud argument between Duke and Eddie. Moments later, around 5 p.m., the two leave Duke's mansion and get into her car to head to an appointment. Eddie was driving the car and Duke was in the passenger seat, and as they make their way down the long driveway, they get to the bottom where there's this 15-foot iron gate. About 12 feet from the gate, Eddie stops the car, puts it in park, and gets out to unlock it. As he's doing this, Duke slides into the driver's seat, takes the car out of park, and hits the gas, hitting Eddie with such force that she breaks through the iron gates and continues to keep her foot on the gas until she crashes into a tree across the street. All while Eddie is being dragged underneath the car. Police quickly arrive on site, and while they're trying to do their job, Police Chief Joseph Heiress pulls up and tells the officers to head back to the station, type up a report, and that he's taking the case over. When the police chief goes back to the station, he sees that one of the officers who was on site is actually typing up the report still, and this is when the chief goes over and yanks the report out of the typewriter, crumples it up, and says, "You don't have to do anything." The next day, that same officer goes to the chief and asks what's going on with the case, and this is when the chief says, "I'm the chief. What I say goes. Now get out of my office." Doris was not formally questioned by police until 2 days after the, quote, accident, and she was only willing to answer 4 questions as she laid in her bed surrounded by her pet dogs and lawyers. Her excuse was, "I just tried to put the car in drive and I accidentally hit the gas instead of the brake."
Sure, Jan.
Duke then claims that Eddie was crushed against the gate, but Eddie's autopsy proved otherwise, since there was not damage consistent with being sandwiched between a car and an iron gate. In fact, the first officer who arrived on site noticed that the victim's fluids were not even on the gate itself, they were only centralized in the middle of the street. Based on the evidence, it actually suggests that when Duke floored the car towards Eddie, he saw her coming and hopped onto the hood of the car itself, and this is when she slammed on the brakes, flinging Eddie from the hood to the ground, which is why his skin and other residue was left behind there. And while he was lying in the street, this is when she decides to floor it again and run him over, dragging him across the road before she hits the tree across the street. In the end, the police chief declared that this was an accident. After this, to do damage control, Duke then donates money to the causes who are related to the people who helped protect her. 7 months after this accident, the police chief then retires and buys 2 condos in Florida. To put the kind of woman that Duke was into perspective, she refused to pay the victim's family any money, even though she was making $1 million a week in interest from her family's fortune alone. Eventually, Eddie's family sued Duke in civil court, where she was found negligent, which meant she had to pay each of his siblings $5,628 each after legal fees. Talk about an awful person. And as always, follow along for all things interesting and horrific.